The call for below. Welcome back to the shadows. This is Eli Nightfall. Tonight we listen in on a conversation that should not be happening. A connection across a divide far greater than any faulty phone line. A call from below. The silence, it was the loudest thing in Mark Caldwell's house. Not the comfortable quiet of evening, but a thick, suffocating presence. It coated the furniture, swallowed the light, pressed against his eardrums. 3 months. 93 days since Sarah was gone. 93 days since the world tilted off its axis and left Mark stranded in this echo chamber where her laughter used to live. People talk about grief coming in waves. For Mark, it was this stillness, a constant, crushing weight. He sat slumped in his armchair. Sarah always called it his throne, a teasing lilt in her voice he'd give anything to hear again. A half-drunk bourbon sat beside him, forgotten. The television flickered, painting shifting, spectral shapes on the walls. Its low murmur, just another texture in the silence he couldn't escape. Outside, the late autumn wind wailed, a lonely sound that clawed at the windows. It used to feel cozy. Now, it felt like the world outside was mourning with him, or perhaps mocking his solitude. His fingers traced the condensation on his glass. Cold. Everything felt cold now. Her favorite books stacked neatly on the table, untouched. The scent of her lavender perfume. A phantom limb in the air, sometimes catching him off guard, a cruel reminder. He missed everything. The pointless arguments, the way she hummed while cooking, the warmth of her body next to his in the vast, empty bed upstairs. Her voice. God, her voice. He yearned for it, the sound that anchored him. Be careful what you wish for. The thought whispered through his mind, cold and unwelcome. He considered another drink. Maybe 2. Enough to blur the edges, to maybe find a few hours of oblivion. That's when it happened. The shrill, sudden ring of the landline jolted him upright, heart slamming against his ribs like a trapped bird. He stared at the phone on the end table. A relic they rarely used anymore. Who would be calling? The display glowed. Unknown number. Probably a telemarketer. A wrong number. He almost let it ring. But it persisted, insistent, jarring. With a sigh of irritation, Mark snatched the receiver. Hello. His voice was rough from disuse. Static. Thick, abrasive, like sandpaper on silk. He almost hung up, thinking it was just a bad connection. But then, beneath the noise, something else. A faint sound. A breath? A whisper? Ice water sluiced through his veins. He clutched the receiver, pressing it hard against his ear, straining to hear over the digital interference. The voice, it was warped, distant, submerged beneath layers of noise, like listening through water. But the cadence, the faint echo of a rhythm he knew intimately. Hello? He managed again, his throat tight. Who is this? More static, a low, humming drone, and then a little clearer, but still horrifyingly distorted. Mark, miss you. No. Impossible. His mind lurched. Grief. It had to be. Hallucinations brought on by sorrow, by exhaustion, by the bourbon. It was the only rational explanation. Yet the name formed on his lips, a desperate, involuntary plea. Sarah. The sound that came back through the receiver wasn't quite a word. It was a drawn-out exhalation, distorted and watery, that could have been a sigh or a sob. And then, one chilling syllable dragged out, filled with an unnerving resonance. Cold. Mark stood frozen, the dial tone buzzing in his ear. The silence rushed back into the room, but it was different now. Charged. Threatening. His hand trembled as he slowly, mechanically, placed the receiver back in its cradle. Unknown number. Static. Sarah's voice. Cold. He sank back into the chair, his body feeling heavy, disconnected. Hallucination. He repeated it to himself. A mantra against the rising tide of fear. A trick of the mind. It had to be, but the chill that lingered wasn't just from the autumn night outside. It seeped into his bones, settling deep within him. This, he realized with dawning horror, wasn't just grief anymore. This was something else. Something that had reached out from the suffocating silence and whispered his name. He didn't know it yet, sitting there in the dim light, the phantom static still echoing in his ears, but the line had been cast. He was being reeled in, pulled towards an abyss disguised by a familiar voice. The story has just begun. The phone has rung once. Will it ring again? What waits for Mark on the other end of that impossible connection? Stay tuned if you dare. The first chapter of The Call from Below is coming right up. Chapter 1. Static on the Line. The digital clock on the cable box glowed 11:17 p.m. Mark hadn't moved from the armchair since the call ended. The dial tone's monotonous buzz still echoing faintly in his ears, a phantom sound layered over the oppressive silence of the house. The bourbon sat untouched, its amber liquid catching the flickering light from the muted television, looking less like comfort and more like poison now. He ran a hand over his face, the rasp of his unshaven cheek loud in the stillness. Hallucination. He clung to the word like a life raft in a churning sea. Grief did strange things to people. He'd read about it, heard stories, widows who saw their dead husbands walking down the street, parents who heard their lost child's laughter on the wind. His mind, starved for Sarah's presence, had simply manufactured a cruel imitation from static and wishful thinking. It was plausible. It was sane. It was the only explanation that didn't open a door onto something cold and terrifyingly vast. He finally pushed himself up, the movement stiff, his joints protesting. He needed to turn off the TV, lock the doors, attempt the nightly ritual of climbing the stairs to the empty bedroom. Routine. That was supposed to help. Keep moving, David had advised, his voice earnest over the phone weeks ago. Don't let yourself stagnate. But Mark felt like he was wading through drying concrete. Every movement required immense effort. Every step forward felt like a retreat. He clicked off the television, plunging the living room into near darkness, save for the weak moonlight filtering through the bay window. The shadows deepened, pooling in the corners, turning familiar shapes, the coat rack by the door, the tall floor lamp, into vaguely menacing silhouettes. He hated the dark now. Before Sarah, it had been intimate, a shared space for whispered secrets and quiet companionship. Now it felt watchful. He checked the front door lock, bolted, and moved towards the kitchen, intending to rinse his glass. The linoleum floor was cold beneath his socked feet. He flicked on the under-cabinet lights, casting a sterile yellow glow over the countertops. Sarah had chosen the cheerful yellow paint for the walls, insisting it would brighten even the gloomiest morning. Now it just seemed garish, mocking his mood. He saw her everywhere in this room. The slightly crooked spice rack sheet hung, the chipped mug with a cartoon cat that was exclusively hers, the faint outline on the fridge where a grocery list used to be pinned. He turned on the tap, the rush of water momentarily drowning out the house's silence. As he rinsed the glass, his gaze drifted to the window above the sink. It looked out onto the backyard, a rectangle of deeper blackness against the slightly less black sky. He thought he saw movement near the old oak tree at the far end of the lawn. A flicker, probably just the wind rustling the remaining leaves or a stray cat. But his heart gave a nervous flutter anyway. Everything felt imbued with potential threat tonight. He placed the glass in the dishwasher, another routine, pointless since he barely used enough dishes to warrant running it, and turned off the kitchen light. Back in the hallway, the stairs loomed like a challenge. He paused at the bottom, hand on the banister. Upstairs was the bedroom, their bedroom, now just his. Upstairs was the closet, still holding her clothes, the scent of her lingering stubbornly. Upstairs was where the emptiness felt most profound. He took a deep breath, the air tasting stale, and began to climb. Each step creaked, the sound unnaturally loud. He imagined the static-filled whisper echoing from the phone downstairs, following him up. Cold, he shook his head, trying to dislodge the memory. Hallucination, stress, grief. Inside the bedroom, he didn't turn on a main light, relying instead on the dim glow from the hallway. The king-sized bed dominated the room, the duvet cover smooth and undisturbed on Sarah's side. He shed his clothes, letting them fall to the floor, another habit Sarah used to gently chide him for, and pulled on an old t-shirt. He avoided looking at himself in the dresser mirror, catching only a glimpse of a haggard stranger with hollow eyes and thinning hair. He hadn't been sleeping well, hadn't been eating right. Grief was consuming him bit by bit. He crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin, the sheets cool against his skin. He lay on his side, facing the empty space where Sarah should have been. He could almost feel the phantom warmth of her, smell the faint trace of her shampoo on the pillowcase he hadn't been able to bring himself to change. He closed his eyes, willing sleep to come, to offer a temporary escape. But sleep remained elusive. His mind raced, replaying the phone call, dissecting the static, the warped syllables. Was it truly Sarah's cadence? Or was his desperate mind just overlaying her memory onto random noise? "Miss you." The phrase twisted in his gut. It sounded like something she'd say, simple, direct. But the distortion, the chilling distance in the voice. And that final word, cold. Why cold? Was it a random syllable generated by crossed wires or a failing connection? Or did it mean something? The image of her grave flashed in his mind. The polished granite headstone, the neatly tended patch of grass beneath the maple tree in St. Augustine Cemetery. Cold ground. Cold stone. He shuddered, pulling the covers tighter. This line of thinking was dangerous, leading down a rabbit hole he wasn't equipped to handle. He needed to think rationally. It was a prank call, perhaps. Some cruel teenagers finding his number. But how would they know Sarah's name? How could they mimic? No, he was imagining the mimicry. It was just noise. He must have drifted off eventually, sinking into a shallow, uneasy sleep filled with fragmented images, static crackling behind his eyelids, a phone receiver covered in frost, Sarah's face turning away from him, shrouded in mist. He woke abruptly, heart pounding, unsure what had disturbed him. The room was utterly dark now, the moon having hidden behind clouds. He lay perfectly still, straining his ears. Was that the wind again? Or something else? A faint scratching sound? Like fingernails on wood? He held his breath, listening intently. Silence. Nothing but the frantic thumping in his own chest. He was letting his imagination run wild, fueled by the bizarre phone call. Nerves. That's all it was. He turned over, punching his pillow, trying to find a comfortable position. Just as he was starting to relax, starting to believe it was just his frayed nerves, it happened again. Sound of the landline phone ringing downstairs. Sharp and piercing in the dead quiet. Mark bolted upright in bed, instantly wide awake, adrenaline surging through him. No, not again. He glanced at the alarm clock on his nightstand. 3:14 a.m. Who the hell would be calling at this hour? His blood ran cold. It couldn't be. He swung his legs out of bed, his feet hitting the cold floorboards. He stood there for a moment, listening to the insistent ringing echoing up the stairs. Each shrill pulse seemed to hammer directly on his nerves. Should he answer it? What if it wasn't a hallucination this time? What if it was real? And if it was real, what did that mean? The ringing continued, relentless. A part of him screamed to ignore it, to pull the covers over his head and pretend it wasn't happening. But another part, the part that still ached with the raw wound of Sarah's absence, felt an unbearable compulsion. What if it was her somehow? Trapped? Needing him? It was insane, impossible. But the desperate hope, however irrational, was a powerful force. He had to know. He stumbled out of the bedroom and hurried down the stairs, his bare feet padding silently on the carpet runner. The ringing seemed to grow louder, more frantic, as he approached the living room. He hesitated in the doorway, his eyes fixed on the phone sitting innocuously on the end table, bathed in the faint, eerie glow of the caller ID display. Unknown number. His hand hovered over the receiver, trembling slightly. He could just unplug the damn thing, throw it against the wall, end this madness. But the unanswered question would torment him. Taking a ragged breath, he snatched the receiver. Sound of phone being picked up, followed immediately by the same thick, crackling static. "Who is this?" Mark demanded, his voice harsh, trying to project an authority he didn't feel. The static hissed and popped for several seconds, a digital blizzard obscuring any potential sound. Mark held his breath, straining to hear. Was there anything there? Or was it just an open line, a technical glitch? Then it came again. The voice. Still distorted, still watery and distant, but somehow clearer than before. More distinct, and unmistakably, terrifyingly, like Sarah. "Mark, help me." His knees felt weak. "Help her? Help her from what? Where? Sarah? Is that you? Where are you?" The questions tumbled out, frantic, desperate. The static surged, almost drowning out the reply. So dark alone. A wave of nausea washed over him. This felt different from the first call. The pleading tone, the specific words, "Help me, dark alone." It wasn't just random noise anymore. It felt like a message. A terrifiant, impossible message. "Sarah, talk to me. What's happening? Where are you?" There was a pause, filled only by the crackling static, which seemed to pulse with a strange rhythm. Then, the voice returned, lower this time, laced with something that sounded chillingly like fear. "You won't let me rest." He? Who was he? Mark's mind scrambled for answers. Was she talking about God? The devil? Something else entirely? "Who won't let you rest? Sarah? Tell me." Another surge of static, louder this time, almost painful to his ear, and through it, one final, chilling phrase, drawn out, echoing with an otherworldly resonance before the line abruptly cut out. "The ground is watching." Sound of a loud click, followed by the dial tone. Mark stood there in the darkness, the dead receiver pressed so hard against his ear it hurt. The dial tone buzzed, mocking him. "The ground is watching." What in God's name did that mean? He slowly lowered the phone, his hand shaking uncontrollably. This wasn't a hallucination. Not twice. Not like this. The specific phrases, the plea for help. The mention of the utterly bizarre final statement. This was something else. Something real. Something impossible. And something utterly terrifying. The silence of the house no longer felt empty. It felt charged, pregnant with unseen watchers, just as the voice had warned. He looked towards the window, towards the dark shape of the backyard. The memory of the phrase chilling him to the core. The ground is watching. He felt goosebumps prickle his arms, the fine hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He wasn't alone in the house. He hadn't been alone for a while. The dial tone droned on, an infuriatingly mundane sound in the face of the impossible horror that had just transpired. Mark finally slammed the receiver down, the plastic clattering in the sudden silence. He backed away from the phone as if it were venomous, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His heart felt like it was trying to hammer its way out of his chest. The ground is watching. The phrase echoed in the hollow space behind his eyes, nonsensical yet viscerally terrifying. It wasn't just static and grief anymore. This was targeted. It was coherent in its own nightmarish way. A plea for help, a warning, a mention of someone, preventing her rest. He sank back into the armchair, pulling his knees up to his chest, wrapping his arms around them like a child warding off monsters in the dark. The living room, moments ago just empty and sad, now felt actively hostile. The shadows weren't just absences of light. They were lurking places. The familiar shapes of furniture seemed poised, waiting. He scanned the room, his eyes darting from the darkened hallway entrance to the black rectangle of the bay window. Was something looking in? Was the ground itself somehow sentient, aware? It was madness, utter madness. Yet the fear was cold, sharp, and undeniably real. He forced himself to think logically, desperately seeking an anchor in the storm. Prank callers? Could someone be using a voice modulator, feeding him lines designed to exploit his grief? It seemed elaborate, cruel beyond measure. But who would know enough? Who would target him like this? And how could they mimic Sarah's voice, even distorted, with such chilling familiarity? He remembered the specific cadence on the word Mark, the slight hesitation before help me. Tiny inflections buried beneath the noise. Inflections that felt agonizingly authentic. No prank caller could replicate that. Could they? What about cross lines? Interference? Could he be picking up fragments of other conversations? His grieving mind stitching them together into a terrifying narrative? It seemed wildly improbable, twice, with phrases that seemed to connect. Help me. So dark, alone. You won't let me rest. The ground is watching. It didn't sound like random fragments. It sounded like a message struggling to get through an immense barrier. He sat there for what felt like hours, shivering despite the stuffy air in the house, listening to the sounds of the night. Every creak of the old house settling, every gust of wind rattling the storm door, every distant car passing on the main road. Each sound made him jump. He kept glancing towards the phone, half expecting, half dreading it would ring again. He considered unplugging it, ripping the cord from the wall. But the thought of severing that connection, however terrifying, felt like abandoning Sarah all over again. What if she was trapped? What if she did need help? The rational part of his brain screamed that it was impossible, but the desperate, grieving husband couldn't ignore the plea. Sleep was out of the question. He stayed downstairs, huddled in the armchair, watching the window as the blackness outside slowly softened into the murky gray of pre-dawn. The first hints of light didn't bring relief, only a harsh clarity that illuminated his exhaustion and fear. The events of the night felt starker, less like a bad dream and more like an inescapable reality he now had to confront. The shadows retreated, but the feeling of being watched lingered, a prickling sensation on his skin. He eventually dragged himself into the kitchen, the garish yellow walls seeming almost offensively cheerful. He made coffee, the familiar ritual feeling hollow and inadequate. As the machine gurgled and hissed, he stared out the window above the sink, looking at the backyard bathed in the weak morning light. Dew glistened on the grass. The old oak tree stood stoically, its bare branches skeletal against the pale sky. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, but the phrase "the ground is watching" imbued the scene with a sinister quality. He scanned the lawn, the flower beds Sarah had meticulously tended, the small patio. Was there something different? Was the earth itself somehow aware? He shook his head, trying to clear the morbid thought. He was losing his mind. The coffee did little to dispel the fog of exhaustion or the icy knot of fear in his stomach. He needed to talk to someone. David. He should call David. His friend was practical, level-headed. Maybe David could offer a rational explanation, talk him down from this ledge of terror. Mark picked up his cell phone, his thumb hovering over David's contact. But what would he say? "Hey, Dave. Funny story. I think my dead wife called me last night. Twice. Says she's trapped and the ground is watching her." David would think he'd finally cracked, drowned his sorrows one too many times. He'd probably insist Mark see a therapist, maybe even suggest medication. He wasn't ready for that level of concerned skepticism. He wasn't ready to be dismissed as crazy, because deep down, a terrifying conviction was solidifying. This wasn't just grief. He put the phone down. Jessica, Sarah's sister? No, that was even worse. She was fragile enough as it was. Burdening her with this would be cruel. He was alone with this, utterly alone. He spent the morning pacing the house, unable to settle, unable to focus. He tried tidying up, hoping mindless activity would help, but he kept finding himself staring into space, replaying the distorted words in his head. He won't let me rest. Who was he? Sarah hadn't been particularly religious. They occasionally attended church on holidays, mostly for tradition, but she wasn't one to speak of divine judgment or eternal damnation. Did she have enemies he didn't know about? Secrets? Their life together had seemed transparent, comfortable, built on mutual trust. Had he missed something? Had she been afraid of someone before the accident? The accident itself had been straightforward, tragic, a patch of black ice on a winding country road, a loss of control, a collision with a tree. The police report was clear. No other vehicles involved. No suspicious circumstances. Just horrible, random chance. Or was it? The thought sent a fresh wave of chills down his spine. Was the he she mentioned somehow connected to her death? He found himself drawn back to the landline phone, staring at its silent, impassive face. He picked up the receiver, listening to the normal dial tone. He checked the caller ID history. Both calls were logged simply as unknown number. No digits, no area code. Untraceable. Of course. He tried calling the phone company's automated service, navigating menus, trying to see if there were records of glitches or line interference reported in his area. Nothing. Everything was functioning normally, according to the robotic voice on the other end. Around noon, exhaustion finally began to win. His eyes felt gritty, his body heavy. He decided to try and lie down, maybe catch an hour or two of sleep. As he headed towards the stairs, he glanced out the front window. Mrs. Gable, his elderly neighbor from across the street, was retrieving her mail. She looked up, saw him in the window, and gave a small, hesitant wave. Mark forced a weak smile and waved back before quickly stepping away from the window. Had she been watching him, or was he just paranoid now, seeing suspicion in every glance? He climbed the stairs again, the journey feeling even longer than the night before. He lay down on the bed, not bothering to get under the covers, simply collapsing onto the mattress. He stared at the ceiling, the familiar water stain in the corner suddenly looking like a distorted face peering down at him. He closed his eyes, but the images persisted. The static-filled void, the warped sound of Sarah's voice, the damp earth of a grave. The ground is watching. He didn't know how long he lay there, teetering on the edge of sleep, but never fully succumbing. The house was quiet again, but it was a tense, waiting quiet. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that the phone would ring again. The connection had been made. Whatever entity was using Sarah's voice, whatever force was holding her, it wasn't finished with him yet. The static was just a prelude. The real horror, he suspected, was still waiting beneath the surface, buried in the cold, watchful ground. And it was calling for him. Chapter 2. Whispers from 6 feet under. Mark must have dozed off a shallow, fitful state hovering just below full consciousness, because the sudden, insistent ringing of his cell phone jolted him violently. He gasped, sitting bolt upright on the bed, heart hammering. For a disoriented second, he thought it was the landline again, the sound echoing from downstairs. Then his bleary eyes focused on the cell phone vibrating insistently on the nightstand. He glanced at the caller ID, David. Relief warred with apprehension. David, his oldest friend, his former college roommate, the best man at his wedding. The anchor of practicality he'd hesitated to call earlier. Now David was calling him. Mark let it ring a few more times, trying to gather his thoughts, trying to smooth the raw edges of panic from his voice before answering. He couldn't sound like a lunatic. He needed to sound grieving. Yes, just grieving. He finally swiped to answer, lifting the phone to his ear. Hey, Dave. He winced inwardly. His voice sounded rough, thick with exhaustion and disuse. Mark? Hey, Mun. You sound like hell. David's voice was familiar, steady, laced with genuine concern. Everything okay? I tried calling earlier, went straight to voicemail. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Phone was off, I guess. Just tired. Mark scrubbed a hand over his face, trying to wake himself up fully. Long night. Understatement of a century. Yeah, I bet, David said softly. Listen, I was thinking, I've got that presentation wrapped up early. How about I swing by this afternoon? Bring some decent coffee, maybe some actual food that doesn't come out of a cardboard box? We could just hang out, watch some football, talk shit about the Jets. Whatever. Mark hesitated. Part of him desperately wanted the company, the normalcy David represented. Another part recoiled at the thought of having to pretend, of having to mask the sheer terror that had taken root inside him. How could he sit and watch football when Sarah was calling him from somewhere else, pleading for help, when the very ground beneath his feet might be watching? Mark? You there? Yeah, I'm here, Mark said quickly. That sounds, yeah, okay, Dave. That'd be good. Maybe seeing David would help. Maybe his friend's presence would banish the lingering chill, make the impossible seem impossible again. Maybe the house wouldn't feel so actively menacing with someone else in it. Great. I'll head out in about an hour, grab some takeout on the way. Any requests? Pizza? Chinese? Doesn't matter. Anything's fine, Mark murmured, his gaze drifting towards the bedroom door, imagining the silent landline phone waiting downstairs. All right, man. Hang tight. See you soon. Yeah, see ya. Mark ended the call, and tossed the phone back onto the nightstand. An hour. He had an hour to pull himself together, to splash water on his face, to try and look less like a man haunted by calls from beyond the grave and more like a man simply mourning his wife. He stood up, his legs stiff, and walked towards the bathroom. The face that stared back from the mirror was gaunt, pale, with dark circles under eyes that seemed too wide. Pupils dilated despite the daylight flooding the room. He looked haunted. He sighed, turning on the tap, the rush of cold water a small, sharp shock against his skin. He showered quickly, the hot water doing little to ease the chill that seemed lodged deep in his bones. He dressed in jeans and a clean sweater, forcing himself through the motions of normalcy. As he combed his wet hair, he caught himself listening intently, straining for any sound from downstairs. Silence. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was the silence of something holding its breath. He went downstairs, deliberately avoiding the living room and the malevolent phone. He busied himself in the kitchen, clearing away the coffee mug, wiping down counters that were already clean. Busy work. Anything to keep his mind occupied, to stop it from replaying the static-laced whispers. Help me. So dark. He won't let me rest. He checked the clock. David would be here soon. He needed to act normal. He went into the living room, forcing himself to sit on the sofa, picking up one of Sarah's mystery novels from the coffee table. He opened it to a random page, pretending to read, though the words blurred into meaningless shapes. His ears, however, were keenly alert, tuned to the slightest noise. The creak of a floorboard upstairs, the hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of wind against the glass. And then it happened. Sound of the landline phone ringing, sharp and demanding. Mark froze, the book falling from his numb fingers onto the carpet. His blood turned to ice. Not now. Not when David was on his way. He stared at the phone, his heart pounding against his ribs like a fist. It rang again, the sound drilling into his skull. This couldn't be happening. He couldn't let David walk in and hear this. He scrambled towards the phone, intending to yank the cord from the wall. Silence it for good this time. But as his hand reached for the cord, the ringing stopped abruptly. Mid-ring, silence descended, sudden and absolute. Mark paused, his hand hovering over the jack. Had it just stopped? Or had someone hung up? He waited, breath held, listening. Nothing. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threat. Had it known David was coming? Was it toying with him? A car door slammed outside. Mark jumped, startled. He hurried to the window, peering through the blinds. David's familiar blue sedan was parked at the curb. David himself was walking up the path, carrying a couple of white paper bags. Normalcy had arrived, but the abrupt silence of the phone felt more chilling than its ringing. It felt calculated. Mark took a deep, shaky breath, smoothed his sweater, and forced his facial muscles into something resembling a welcoming expression. He opened the front door just as David reached the top step. "Hey," David said, offering a sympathetic smile. He looked Mark up and down, his smile fading slightly. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "Something like that," Mark mumbled, stepping aside to let him in. "Coffee smells good." "Got your usual poison," David said, holding up one of the bags. "And enough General Tso's to feed a small army." He stepped inside, glancing around the usually immaculate living room. Mark noticed for the first time the thin layer of dust on the coffee table, the slight disarray. "Place looks lived in," David commented, though his tone was gentle. "Yeah, well, housekeeping hasn't been my top priority," Mark said, trying for a lightness he didn't feel. He gestured towards the kitchen. "Let's put this stuff down." As they walked towards the kitchen, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes following them. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows of the hallway, despite the bright afternoon light. In the kitchen, David started unpacking the food containers onto the table, his movements efficient and familiar. He'd spent countless evenings here with Mark and Sarah, laughing, eating, sharing stories. The memory brought a fresh pang of grief, sharp and painful. "So," David began, pulling out plates from the cabinet. "How you really doing, man? No bullshit." He leaned against the counter, his gaze direct, searching. Mark averted his eyes, focusing on opening a container of rice. Surviving. You know, one day at a time. The Genera platitude felt like ash in his mouth. Yeah, David said quietly. Look, Mark, I know it's impossible, what you're going through, but you seem more than just grieving. You seem spooked. Is something else going on? Mark froze, his hand hovering over the rice container. Should he tell him? Could he risk it? David was his best friend. If he couldn't trust David, who could he trust? But the memory of the phone cutting off just before David arrived, it felt like a warning. Don't speak. Spooked. Mark forced a weak laugh. Nah, just exhausted. Not sleeping well, like I said. Bad dreams. David didn't look convinced. He studied Mark for a long moment. What kind of bad dreams? Just stupid stuff. Confused. You know how dreams are. Mark busied himself scooping rice onto a plate, avoiding David's probing gaze. He could feel his friend's skepticism, his concern. They ate mostly in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the clinking of forks against plates and the low hum of the refrigerator. David kept glancing at Mark, a worried frown creasing his forehead. Mark focused intently on his food, trying to project an aura of normalcy, trying to ignore the icy tendrils of fear coiling in his stomach. Did you happen to notice? Mark began, trying to sound casual. Anything weird with the phone lines lately? Static? Bad connections? David paused, chewing thoughtfully. No, can't say I have. Why? You having trouble? Oh, just thought I heard some static earlier. Probably nothing. Mark shrugged, trying to seem dismissive. You still have the landline hooked up? David asked, gesturing vaguely towards the living room. Thought you guys only kept that for Sarah's Aunt Carol. Yeah, well, haven't gotten around to disconnecting it, Mark mumbled. David finished a mouthful of chicken. You know, Mark, it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to be falling apart. Hell, I would be. But if something specific is freaking you out, you can tell me, man. Seriously. Mark looked up, meeting David's earnest gaze. He saw the genuine concern there, the unwavering friendship. He opened his mouth, the words hovering on the tip of his tongue. Dave, Sarah's calling me. From the grave. I think she's trapped. I think something terrible is happening. But before he could speak, it happened again. Not the phone this time. A low, guttural sound echoed from upstairs. A scraping noise, followed by a distinct, heavy thud, like something large and heavy falling over. Both men froze, forks halfway to their mouths. They looked at each other, wide-eyed. What the hell was that? David whispered, his casual demeanor vanishing instantly. Mark's blood ran cold. He hadn't imagined it. David had heard it too. It wasn't just in his head. Something was in the house. Something upstairs. I don't know. Mark stammered, his voice barely audible. The fear he'd been trying to suppress surged back, overwhelming him. Another sound, a soft, dragging noise, coming from the direction of the master bedroom. Their bedroom. David pushed his chair back slowly, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Is there anyone else here? Mark shook his head, unable to speak. His gaze was locked on the kitchen doorway, leading to the hall and the stairs. The scraping sound started again, louder this time, closer to the top of the stairs. It sounded wet, like something heavy being dragged across the wooden floor. The whispers hadn't just been on the phone line. They were starting inside the house. And they weren't alone anymore. The scraping sound returned, slow and deliberate, punctuated by a soft, wet schlick noise that made the hairs on the back of Mark's neck stand on end. It seemed to be moving away from the bedroom door, towards the far wall. David pushed himself fully away from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the linoleum, the sound making both of them jump. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously towards the hallway entrance. Okay, David said, his voice low and tight. That's not the house settling. No, Mark whispered. His legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. Every horror movie instinct screamed at him to grab David and run out the front door, to not be the idiot who goes towards the noise. But this wasn't a movie. This was his house. Sarah's house. And those sounds, they felt intrinsically linked to the chilling calls, to the plea for help, to the entity that wouldn't let her rest. He couldn't run. We need to check it out, David stated, though his voice lacked conviction. He looked at Mark, searching his face. Unless you know what that is. Mark shook his head mutely. He wished he did. Even a rational, terrifying explanation, a burglar, a trapped animal, would be preferable to the formless dread coiling in his gut. The dread whispered that this was connected to the phone, to the empty grave he didn't yet know about, to Sarah's chilling pronouncement, "The ground is watching." The dragging sound stopped. Silence descended again, thick and heavy. Mark found he was holding his breath, listening with an intensity that made his ears ache. Was it waiting? Listening for them? Maybe it stopped. David offered, though he didn't move. Maybe it was, I don't know, a pipe? Something falling in the attic? That didn't sound like a pipe, Mark said, finally finding his voice. And it came from the bedroom. He looked at David, a silent question passing between them. They couldn't just stay down here, wondering. David nodded grimly. All right, stick close. You got anything, for protection? Mark's mind went blank for a second. Protection? Against what? A ghost? A sound? Then he remembered the heavy Maglite flashlight he kept in the kitchen drawer. Not exactly a weapon, but it was solid metal. Flashlight, he croaked, pulling open the drawer and retrieving it. Its weight felt reassuringly solid in his trembling hand. Okay, David said, taking a deep breath. Let's go. Quietly. They moved out of the kitchen, Mark gripping the Maglite. David scanning the hallway ahead. The house seemed unnaturally still, every shadow pregnant with possibility. Mark felt hyper-aware of every detail. The slight warp in the floorboard near the coat rack, the dust motes dancing in the shaft of light from the living room window, the faint scent of David's Chinese food hanging in the air. A bizarrely mundane counterpoint to their fear. They reached the foot of the stairs. The dragging sound hadn't resumed. Mark strained his ears, listening for anything, a breath, a footstep, a whisper. Nothing. Only the frantic thumping of his own heart. He looked up the staircase towards the shadowy landing. The door to the master bedroom was at the far end, slightly to the left. It was closed as he'd left it. You first, David whispered, gesturing with his head. Mark nodded, his throat dry. He placed his foot on the first step, testing it. It creaked loudly in the silence. Both men flinched. Mark took another step, then another, moving slowly, deliberately, trying to minimize the noise. David followed close behind, his footsteps lighter, more cautious. The air grew colder as they ascended, a noticeable drop in temperature that hadn't been there when Mark came down earlier. He shivered, goosebumps rising on his arms beneath the sweater. Halfway up, Mark paused again, listening. Still nothing. The silence was almost worse than the noise. It felt like the prelude to a jump scare, the tightening of a spring before it snapped. He risked a glance back at David, who met his gaze with wide, apprehensive eyes. David swallowed hard, then nodded for Mark to continue. They reached the landing. The hallway stretched before them, dimly lit by the light filtering up from downstairs and a small window at the far end. For doors led off the landing, the master bedroom, the guest room, a bathroom, and a linen closet. All were closed. Mark's eyes were fixed on the master bedroom door. Did he imagine it, or was the wood darker near the bottom edge, as if something had seeped underneath? He tightened his grip on the Maglite. David moved up beside him, his shoulder brushing Mark's. See anything? David breathed, his voice barely audible. Mark shook his head slightly. He crept forward towards the bedroom door, David matching his steps. The cold spot seemed to intensify as they approached, radiating outwards from the closed door. Mark could feel it on his face. His hands. It was an unnatural cold, damp and cloying, like the air in a cellar. He reached the door. He put his ear close to the wood, listening. Silence. Utter, profound silence from within. He reached out a trembling hand towards the doorknob. It felt icy cold to the touch, colder than the surrounding air. He hesitated, looking back at David. David gave a minute nod, his expression tense. Taking another ragged breath, Mark turned the knob slowly. The latch clicked back with exaggerated loudness. He pushed the door inward just a crack at first, peering into the gloom beyond. The curtains were drawn, plunging the room into deep shadow, broken only by thin slivers of daylight leaking around the edges. He couldn't see much. The bed, the dresser, the vague shapes of furniture. No immediate sign of disturbance. He pushed the door open wider, stepping hesitantly across the threshold, raising the mag light, ready to switch it on. David crowded in behind him, peering over his shoulder. The cold in the room was intense, palpable. Mark fumbled for the light switch just inside the door. He flicked it up. Nothing happened. The overhead light didn't turn on. "Bulb out," David whispered. "It was working this morning," Mark replied, his voice tight. He thumbed the switch on the mag light. A bright beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the room. The beam landed first on the bed, undisturbed, pillows plump, duvet smooth. Then it moved across the floor and stopped. Mark's breath hitched. David let out a low gasp behind him. There on the hardwood floor, leading from the area near Sarah's side of the bed towards the closet on the far wall, was a trail, a smear, dark, wet, glistening slightly in the flashlight beam. It looked disturbingly like something heavy, soaked in something dark, had been dragged across the floor. The scraping noise, the wet schlick. This was it. The trail ended abruptly at the closed closet door. Mark swept the light around the rest of the room. A bedside lamp on Sarah's nightstand lay on the floor, its shade dented. The bulb shattered. That must have been the thud they heard. Something had knocked it over. But what? And why? Jesus Christ, David breathed, his voice shaky. What the hell is that? He pointed the beam of his own phone flashlight at the smear. Is that oil? Mud? Mark knew, with a sickening certainty that twisted his insides, that it wasn't oil or mud. He didn't know what it was, but the dark reddish-brown hue, the slight metallic tang that seemed to hang in the cold air, it was terrifyingly suggestive. He took a step closer, crouching down, careful not to touch the smear. The flashlight beam illuminated the texture, thick, viscous in places, already starting to dry and flake at the edges. "Mark, don't touch it," David warned. Grabbing his arm, Mark pulled back, standing up quickly. His eyes were drawn to the closet door at the end of the trail. The dark smear licked up against the bottom edge of the white-painted wood. Whatever had made the trail had gone in there, or come out of there. "The closet," Mark whispered. "That's where Sarah kept most of her clothes, her shoes, boxes of keepsakes." It was deep a walk-in, though cluttered. David shone his light on the closet door. "Did you hear anything from in there?" Mark shook his head. The sounds had seemed to stop near the wall by the closet. Not necessarily in it, but the trail led right to it. "We have to look," Mark said, the words tasting like bile. He didn't want to. Every instinct screamed against opening that door. But the alternative, leaving it closed, wondering what horror lay within, was somehow worse. He moved towards the closet, the beam of the mag light shaking slightly in his hand. David stayed close behind him, playing his own light around the room, checking the corners, the window, the space under the bed, as if expecting something to leap out. Mark reached the closet door. He put his hand on the knob. It was cold like the bedroom doorknob, but this one also felt damp, sticky. He hesitated for only a second, then pulled the door open. The flashlight beam plunged into the darkness of the walk-in closet. Hangers crowded with clothes, Sarah's dresses, blouses, coats. Shoe boxes stacked precariously on the shelf above. Cardboard boxes filled with forgotten items on the floor. Everything looked normal, crowded, slightly messy, but normal. There was no monstrous entity lurking within, no obvious source for the terrifying trail outside. Mark swept the light slowly from side to side, probing the depths of the closet, illuminating hanging garments, stacks of sweaters. The dark recesses behind boxes. Nothing. No intruder. No animal. No explanation. "Anything?" David asked from the doorway, his voice tense. "No," Mark said, frustration mixing with his fear. "Nothing. It's empty. Just her stuff." He let the beam linger on a familiar blue dress Sarah loved, a painful lump forming in his throat. He was about to turn away, confused and more scared than ever, when the beam caught something on the floor, tucked away behind a large storage box in the back corner. It wasn't the source of the trail, but it was something out of place. A small, old-fashioned wooden music box. Sarah's grandmother had given it to her. Mark remembered her keeping it on her dresser, not hidden away in the back of a closet. He frowned, stepping further in, nudging the storage box aside with his foot. The music box sat innocently on the dusty floor. It was closed. As Mark's light fell fully upon it, the lid slowly, deliberately creaked open. Sound of a faint, tinkling, slightly off-key music box melody begins, distorted and slow. Mark froze, the maglite beam fixed on the tiny, rotating ballerina figure inside the now-open box. The melody was familiar, a lullaby Sarah sometimes hummed, but it was playing too slowly, the notes dragging, discordant, like a dying music box struggling to play its final tune. And beneath the tinny music, almost too faint to hear, was another sound. A whisper, coming not from the music box itself, but seeming to emanate from the air around it, from the deep shadows of the closet. It was the same distorted, watery whisper from the phone, but clearer now, closer, chillingly intimate. Always watching, David, hearing the music, stepped into the closet beside Mark. What the? He stopped as he heard the whisper, his eyes widening in disbelief and horror. The tiny ballerina continued its slow, jerky rotation. The music slowed further, grinding almost to a halt. The whisper came again, a sibilant breath in the cold, dead air. From below. Chapter 3. The Hollow Ground. The distorted music box melody finally ground to a halt with a faint, metallic sigh. The whisper faded, leaving only the oppressive silence and the image of the tiny, motionless ballerina burned into Mark's retinas. He and David stood frozen in the closet doorway, the beam from Mark's maglite still fixed on the small wooden box. David's phone light dancing nervously around the shadowed corners. The unnatural cold seemed to deepen, leaching the warmth from their bodies. From below, the words hung in the air, an impossible echo confirming Mark's deepest fears. It wasn't just his imagination. David had heard it too. The calls, the noises, the whispers, they were real. And they were connected to Sarah. David finally broke the silence, his voice a harsh whisper. Okay, that's it. We're calling the cops. He fumbled with his phone, his fingers shaking. And tell them what? Mark asked, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. He felt strangely detached, as if watching himself in a movie. That my dead wife's music box whispered at us? That we heard scraping sounds and found a weird smear on the floor? They'll think we're drunk or high. We're crazy. There's a goddamn trail of something out there, David hissed, gesturing back towards the bedroom. And that thing just talked to us. This isn't normal, Mark. I know it's not normal, Dave. Mark snapped, the detachment shattering, replaced by a surge of raw fear and frustration. Believe me, I know, but the cops aren't equipped for this. Whatever this is, he trailed off, unable to articulate the sheer wrongness of it all. He looked back at the music box, then at the dark trail leading to the closet. From below, the phrase resonated with the earlier call. The ground is watching. Was Sarah underground? Trapped somehow? The thought was horrifying, illogical, yet resonated with a terrifying certainty. What are you thinking? David asked, lowering his phone slightly, sensing the shift in Mark's demeanor. Mark took a shaky breath. The calls. The first one, she said she was cold. The second one, the ground is watching. He looked at David, his eyes pleading for understanding, or perhaps just shared madness. And now, from below, David stared at him, comprehension dawning slowly in his eyes, mixed with disbelief. You think she's... He couldn't finish the sentence. I don't know what I think, Mark admitted. But the calls, the whispers, this... He gestured vaguely at the smear, the closet. It all feels connected. To her. To where she is. He paused, the next thought solidifying, stark and terrifying. Her grave. David recoiled slightly. Mark, no. Don't go there. Grief does weird things, man. Maybe we're both just stressed, sleep-deprived. Did stress make that music box talk? Mark countered, his voice rising. Did grief make that trail on the floor? Did you hear her voice, Dave? Did you? David ran a hand through his hair, looking utterly lost. I heard something. It sounded like her. Distorted. But how is that possible? I don't know how, Mark said, feeling a desperate sense of urgency. But I know I can't ignore it. I can't sit here waiting for the next whisper, the next call. If she's trying to tell me something, if she needs help. He looked towards the bedroom window, towards the gray afternoon light filtering through the drawn curtains. St. Augustine's cemetery wasn't far. A 10-minute drive. We have to go there. We have to check. Check what? Mark, it's a cemetery. Her grave is there. Sealed. It's... David searched for the right word. It's final. Is it? Mark met David's gaze, his own eyes probably looking wild, unhinged. She said, he won't let me rest. She said, help me. What if something happened? What if she's not resting? The implications were monstrous, unthinkable, yet the whispers insisted. David looked torn, horrified by the suggestion, yet clearly shaken by what he had witnessed. He glanced back at the smear on the floor, then at the silent music box. He knew Mark well enough to see the conviction, however insane, hardening in his friend's eyes. He sighed a long, weary exhalation. This is crazy. You know that, right? Completely, certifiably insane. Maybe, Mark conceded, but I have to know. All right, David said finally, rubbing his temples. All right, we go. We look. But if everything is normal, Mark, promise me you'll talk to someone. A doctor. A professional. Fine. Mark agreed instantly, relief washing over him. He wasn't alone in this anymore. Let's go. Now. They backed out of the closet, leaving the small wooden box sitting silently in the shadows. Mark deliberately avoided looking at the smear on the floor as they left the bedroom, pulling the door shut behind them, plunging the room back into darkness and cold. He didn't bother trying the light switch again. They hurried down the stairs, the oppressive atmosphere of the upper floor seeming to cling to them. Mark grabbed his keys and wallet from the small table by the front door, pausing only to glance at the silent landline phone in the living room. It looked inert, harmless now, but he knew better. It was a conduit, a receiver for horrors he was only beginning to understand. Outside, the crisp autumn air felt like a relief after the cloying coldness of the bedroom. The sky was overcast, threatening rain. They climbed into David's sedan, the familiar interior a small pocket of normalcy in a world rapidly tilting into madness. David started the engine, the rumble grounding. St. Augustine's? He asked, his voice tight. Yeah, Mark confirmed, staring straight ahead through the windshield. Take the river road, it's quicker. The drive was tense, filled with an uncomfortable silence. David focused on the road, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Mark stared out the window, watching the familiar suburban landscape blur past. Houses, shops, parks, everything seeming mundane, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in his life. What were they going to find? He simultaneously craved and dreaded the answer. What if the grave was undisturbed? That would mean the whispers, the calls, were something else entirely, perhaps even more terrifying because their source would remain unknown. What if it wasn't undisturbed? The implications of that were too horrific to fully contemplate. They reached the wrought iron gates of St. Augustine's Cemetery, established in the late 1800s. It was a sprawling place, a mix of old, weathered tombstones leaning at odd angles and newer, polished granite markers laid out in neat rows. Ancient oaks draped with Spanish moss dotted the landscape, their branches like skeletal arms reaching towards the gray sky. It was usually a peaceful place, serene even. Today it felt ominous, watchful. David drove slowly along the winding paved path, following Mark's quiet directions. Turn left up here, then right at the old mausoleum. She's near the back, under the big maple. He pulled the car to a stop on the narrow lane beside a large, sprawling maple tree, its remaining leaves a dull, faded yellow. A few rows in from the path, nestled between an older, ivy-covered stone and a newer, simpler marker, was Sarah's grave. Sarah and Caldwell, beloved wife. May she rest in peace. The simple inscription on the polished gray granite felt like a cruel joke now. He won't let me rest. They both got out of the car, the damp air chilling them instantly. A light drizzle had begun to fall, cold pinpricks against their skin. Mark walked towards the grave, his steps feeling heavy, hesitant. David followed, a few paces behind, looking around nervously, as if expecting something to leap out from behind a tombstone. From a distance, everything looked normal. The headstone stood straight. The grass covering the plot was green, neatly trimmed, though damp from the drizzle. A small bouquet of faded mums lay near the base of the stone, left over from Mark's last visit a couple of weeks ago. Relief warred with disappointment. It looked fine, undisturbed. Maybe David was right. Maybe it was just grief. But as Mark got closer, within a few feet of the headstone, he stopped dead. His blood ran cold. It wasn't undisturbed. Not completely. The earth directly over the grave, the rectangular plot where the coffin lay buried 6 feet below, looked wrong. The grass wasn't lying flat and even. It looked disturbed, as if someone had recently dug it up and then hastily tried to replace the sods. There were subtle indentations, uneven patches, clumps of darker soil showing through the green blades. And near the center, almost hidden beneath a patch of poorly replaced turf, was a distinct depression, like the ground had settled or sunk. "Dave," Mark choked out, pointing with a trembling finger. "Look." David stepped forward cautiously, his eyes scanning the ground. He crouched down, peering intently at the uneven turf, the slight sinking in the middle. He reached out and touched a clump of damp earth that seemed recently overturned. He looked up at Mark, his face pale, stripped of all skepticism. "Something's wrong," David whispered. This looks fresh. Someone's been digging here." Mark felt a wave of dizziness, leaning a hand against the cold granite headstone for support. Someone had been digging. At Sarah's grave. Why? Who? The word he echoed in his mind. "He won't let me rest. We need a shovel," Mark said, his voice raspy. The idea was insane, sacrilegious even. But the whispers, the trail, the disturbed earth, they demanded answers. David stared at him, aghast. "Mark, we can't just dig her up. That's illegal. That's desecration." "What if she's not in there, Dave?" Mark countered, his voice shaking with a terrifying mixture of hope and dread. "What if they took her? What if that's what she's trying to tell me? That she's not here? Took her? Who would take her? Why?" David shook his head violently. "This is crazy. Is it crazier than a whispering music box?" Mark shot back. "Is it crazier than phone calls from the dead? Something is fundamentally wrong here. And it leads back to this spot." He gestured wildly at the disturbed ground. "I have to know what's underneath." The drizzle was turning into a steady, cold rain now, plastering their hair to their foreheads, soaking through their clothes. David looked from the grave to Mark's desperate face, then back again. The evidence was right there beneath their feet. The sinking ground, the recently turned soil. He wiped rain from his eyes, his resolve crumbling under the weight of the inexplicable. "My trunk," David said grimly. "I have a small foldable shovel. For emergencies. Winter driving." Mark nodded numbly. "Get it." While David hurried back to the car, Mark stood staring at the grave, his mind racing. If Sarah wasn't in the coffin, where was she? And who had dug her up? And why? The questions hammered at him, each one more terrifying than the last. The smear on the floor, had it been dirt? Soil from the grave, tracked into the house. By whom? Or what? David returned, carrying a compact, foldable shovel with a short handle. He unfolded it, the metal scraping loudly in the rainy quiet. He handed it to Mark. "Are you sure about this?" "There's no going back." Mark looked down at the shovel, then at the grave. He thought of Sarah's distorted voice, pleading for help, speaking of cold and darkness. From below, he tightened his grip on the handle. "I'm sure." He knelt beside the grave, the knees of his jeans instantly soaking through from the wet grass. He hesitated for only a moment, whispering a silent apology to Sarah or whatever memory of her remained sacred. Then he plunged the tip of the shovel into the disturbed earth near the sunken center. The sod came away easily, too easily, revealing dark, wet soil underneath. He tossed it aside and dug again. The digging was surprisingly easy at first, the soil loose, recently disturbed, confirming their suspicions. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead, dripped into his eyes, but he barely noticed. He worked with frantic energy, driven by a desperate need to know. David stood beside him. Holding the mag light David had retrieved from the car, its beam cutting through the deepening twilight and the falling rain, illuminating Mark's grim task. He dug deeper, maybe a foot down, then two. The soil became more compacted, harder to break through. His muscles started to burn, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't slow down. He was searching for the hard resistance of wood. The top of the coffin. He dug further. 3 feet. 4. Sweat mixed with the rain on his face. Still nothing but earth. Dark, cloying, wet earth that smelled faintly metallic. Like the air in the bedroom closet. Where was it? Even a cheap coffin would be closer to the surface than this. He paused, leaning on the shovel, trying to catch his breath. Confusion warring with his fear. It should be here, he gasped, looking up at David. Shouldn't it? David shone the light deeper into the hole Mark had dug. It was at least 4 feet deep now. Maybe more. Wide enough to reveal nothing. No sign of a coffin lid. No wood splinters. Nothing but more dirt. Maybe it sunk deeper? David offered weakly, though he didn't sound convinced. Mark shook his head. He had one last, terrifying thought. He repositioned himself and began digging frantically again, not downwards but outwards, widening the hole, clearing the soil away from the edges. If the coffin wasn't there, had it been removed entirely? His shovel struck something hard. Not wood. Metal? He scraped away the dirt around it. It was a rock, large and flat, wedged into the soil. He dug around it, frustrated, then hit something else. Another rock, and another. The entire cavity, where a coffin should have rested, seemed to be filled not just with loose earth, but with hastily thrown-in rocks and debris, as if someone had dug up the coffin and then quickly filled the hole with whatever was nearby to disguise the emptiness. Mark scrambled out of the hole, his hands raw, his body trembling with exertion and horror. He stared down into the shadowed cavity illuminated by David's flashlight beam. It was deep enough. It was long enough. But it was empty. There was no coffin. Sarah wasn't there. The grave was hollow. Just then, as the full horror of the discovery washed over them, Mark's cell phone, tucked forgotten into his back pocket, began to ring. The sound, jarringly cheerful in the desolate, rainy graveyard, made both men jump violently. Mark fumbled it out, his hands muddy and shaking. Caller ID, unknown number. His heart stopped. He looked at David, whose face was a mask of terror in the flashlight beam. He knew, they both knew, who or what was calling. Swallowing hard, Mark answered the call, holding the phone to his ear with a trembling hand. Sound of intense static, louder, more aggressive than before. The static crackled, thick and menacing. Then the voice came through. No longer just a whisper, but a distorted, ragged cry, filled with a chilling mixture of anguish and something else, something cold and predatory. Told you watching, and then a sound that wasn't Sarah's voice. A low, guttural chuckle that seemed to reverberate from the very earth beneath their feet, echoing up from the empty hole where Sarah Caldwell was supposed to be resting in peace. Sound of the low, guttural chuckle mixing with the static, then the line abruptly cuts off. Chapter 4. What Rises in the Dark. The guttural chuckle echoed in the buzzing silence left by the dead phone line, a sound so viscerally wrong, so alien, that it seemed to scrape against Mark's soul. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't human. It was the sound of something ancient and predatory, amused by their terror, confirming their presence at the desecrated grave. Mark stood frozen, phone still pressed to his ear, the rain plastering his hair to his skull, chilling him far deeper than the damp air ever could. Beside him, David made a choked sound, stumbling back a step from the yawning emptiness of the grave, his flashlight beam wavering wildly across the muddy hole and the surrounding tombstones. "Did you hear that?" David whispered, his voice cracking. That wasn't her. Mark could only nod, lowering the phone slowly, his gaze locked on the dark cavity in the earth. Empty. Hollow. Sarah wasn't here. She hadn't been here. Someone, or something, had taken her, and now was laughing at them. The whispers, the pleas for help, the warnings, they were real, but perhaps they weren't just from Sarah. Perhaps they were bait. Or perhaps she was trapped with the entity that had just chuckled in his ear. "We have to get out of here," David urged, grabbing Mark's arm, his fingers digging in with surprising strength. "Now, Mark." Before. He didn't finish the sentence, but Mark understood. Before whatever made that sound decided to reveal itself. Before the watching ground did more than just watch. Panic finally broke through Mark's paralysis. He looked down at the shovel, still lying beside the hole, then at the disturbed earth. The muddy cavity gaping open in the rain-swept twilight. Leaving it like this felt wrong, exposing their act, but the thought of staying here a second longer, trying to refill the hole under the unseen gaze of whatever lurked nearby, was unbearable. "Go!" Mark yelled, shoving David toward the car. "Go!" They scrambled away from the grave, slipping on the wet grass, casting frantic glances back at the empty hole and the surrounding shadows. The cemetery, moments ago merely ominous, now felt actively hostile. The ancient tombstones like decaying teeth in a hungry maw. The wind sighing through the skeletal branches of the trees like mocking whispers. Mark fumbled with his keys, his hands slick with mud and rain, finally managing to unlock the car doors. They threw themselves inside, slamming the doors shut, the sound echoing in the unnerving quiet. David immediately locked the doors, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Mark jammed the key into the ignition, twisting it violently. The engine roared to life, blessedly loud and normal. He slammed the gear shift into reverse, tires spinning on the wet grass and mud before finding purchase on the paved lane. He didn't look back as he sped away from Sarah's violated grave, navigating the winding cemetery paths with reckless speed, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. David sat rigidly in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, his face ashen. The wrought iron gates of St. Augustine's loomed ahead, offering the illusion of escape. Mark didn't slow down until they were back on the main road, merging into the sparse evening traffic. The familiar glow of streetlights pushing back the encroaching darkness. Only then did he ease his foot off the accelerator, his body trembling with adrenaline and residual terror. "Jesus Christ." David breathed out, the words shaky. "Jesus Christ, Mark. Her coffin, it's gone. Someone dug her up." "Who? What?" "I don't know," Mark replied, his voice hoarse. He kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something monstrous keeping pace with them in the rain-streaked darkness. The calls that she mentioned, maybe he took her. "He? Who is he?" David demanded. "This isn't making any sense. People don't just dig up bodies." And that laugh. He shuddered violently. That wasn't human. "I know." Mark's mind raced, trying to piece together the impossible fragments. The phone calls, the whispers, the smear on the floor, the disturbed grave, the missing coffin, the chilling chuckle. It painted a picture of calculated, malevolent interference reaching beyond the veil of death itself. Sarah wasn't resting. She was taken, used. Her voice twisted into a lure by something ancient and evil that resided below, in the ground. "What do we do?" David asked, voicing the question screaming in Mark's own head. "We still can't go to the police." "Excuse me, officer, my dead wife's coffin is missing," and something inhuman laughed at us over the phone after she called me from beyond the grave. "They'd lock us up." "No police," Mark agreed grimly. "Not yet. Not until we know more." "No more? How are we supposed to find out more?" David sounded desperate. "We're dealing with... I don't even know what we're dealing with. Ghosts? Demons? Something worse." Mark didn't have an answer. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, focusing on the road, on putting distance between them and the hollow ground of St. Augustine's. The rain lashed against the windshield, the wipers struggling to keep pace, blurring the lights of oncoming cars into streaks of color. He felt trapped in a nightmare, driving through a world that seemed terrifyingly unaware of the horrors lurking just beneath its surface. They drove the rest of the way back to Mark's house in silence, each lost in his own terrified thoughts. As Mark turned onto his street, the familiar houses looked alien, potentially threatening. He half expected to see figures standing motionless on lawns, watching them pass. Paranoia gnawed at him, sharp and insistent. They were being watched. The voice had said so. The chuckle confirmed it. He pulled into his driveway, cutting the engine. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the drumming of rain on the car roof. Neither of them moved to get out immediately. The house loomed before them, dark except for the faint light they'd left on in the kitchen. It no longer felt like home, like a sanctuary. It felt like ground zero, the place where the connection had first been made, the place where the entity had left its physical mark. "I should probably go home," David said finally, his voice strained. "Check on Linda. Tell her I got held up." Mark looked at him. He saw the fear in his friend's eyes, the desperate urge to flee back to normalcy, to the safety of his own life. Mark couldn't blame him. But the thought of being alone in that house right now, knowing what they knew, was terrifying. "Stay," Mark said, the word escaping before he could stop it. "Just for a bit. Please, Dave. I don't think I could be alone in there right now." David hesitated, looking from Mark's desperate face to the dark house. He ran a hand over his wet hair, sighed again, a sound of resignation and fear. Okay, Mark. For a bit. But we need a plan. We can't just sit here waiting for the next, whatever." They got out of the car, hunching their shoulders against the driving rain, and hurried towards the front door. Mark fumbled with the lock, his cold fingers clumsy. As the door swung open, revealing the dark hallway, a blast of cold air seemed to rush out to meet them. Colder than the outside air, carrying the same faint, damp, cellar-like smell they'd encountered upstairs. Mark froze on the threshold, his senses screaming danger. "Did you feel that?" David asked, stopping behind him. Mark nodded grimly. "It's getting stronger." They stepped inside, closing and locking the door behind them. Mark flicked on the hallway light, the bulb flickering weakly before casting a pale, uncertain glow. He strained his ears, listening. The house was silent. Too silent. No creaks, no settling noises, just a dead, waiting stillness. "Okay," David said, trying to sound practical, though his voice trembled slightly. "First things first. Let's check the house. Every room. Make sure we're alone." It seemed like a futile gesture against something potentially non-corporeal, but the need to do something was overwhelming. Mark nodded, grabbing the mag light he'd left near the door. They started downstairs, methodically checking the living room, the dining room, the small den. Everything was as they'd left it. Dust motes danced in the flashlight beams. Shadows clung to the corners. The landline phone sat silently on the end table, looking almost smug. Mark felt an urge to smash it, rip it from the wall, but he resisted. It was their only connection, however terrifying, to Sarah, or whatever was using her voice. They moved to the kitchen. The remnants of their hastily abandoned meal sat on the table. Containers of cooling Chinese food, looking obscene in the tense atmosphere. Nothing seemed out of place. They checked the back door, locked, and peered out the window into the rainy darkness of the backyard. Nothing moved but the wind-whipped trees. Then the stairs. They ascended slowly, cautiously. Mark leading with the flashlight, David close behind. The cold spot on the landing was still there, perhaps even more intense. Mark shone the light on the master bedroom door. It remained closed. "Do we?" David began. "We have to," Mark said, his voice grim. He pushed the door open again. The darkness inside felt thick, heavy. He flicked the light switch. Still nothing. He swept the mag light beam across the room. The smear was still there, a dark, ugly wound on the hardwood floor. The overturned lamp lay where it had fallen. The closet door was slightly ajar, just as they'd left it. He stepped inside, David reluctantly following. The cold was biting. Mark shone the light towards the back of the closet, towards the spot where the music box sat. It was gone. Mark swept the beam frantically around the closet floor. Empty hangers, stacks of clothes, boxes, but the small wooden music box was nowhere to be seen. "Where is it?" David whispered, crowding closer. "Did we knock it over? Did it fall behind something?" Mark knelt down, pushing aside boxes, lifting hanging clothes. Nothing. It had simply vanished. Had it taken it back? Or had it never truly been there, Just another auditory and visual hallucination designed to lure them, to torment them. He didn't know which possibility was worse. He felt a fresh wave of despair wash over him. Every clue seemed to dissolve into more questions, more impossibility. He stood up, shaking his head at David. It's gone. They checked the other rooms upstairs, the guest room, the bathroom. Both were empty, undisturbed, though the same unnatural chill seemed to pervade the entire upper floor now. Defeated and more terrified than ever, they retreated downstairs. David sank onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. I don't understand any of this, Mark. Missing bodies, whispering music boxes that disappear, phone calls from hell. What does it want? I don't know, Mark said, pacing the living room like a caged animal. It mentioned Sarah. It used her voice. It knew we were at the grave. He stopped, struck by a sudden thought. The smear. The trail leading to the closet. Maybe it wasn't just leaving a mark. Maybe it was taking something. He strode back towards the stairs, ignoring David's questioning look. He took the stairs two at a time, heading back into the master bedroom, ignoring the cold, ignoring the smear. He went directly to Sarah's dresser. He pulled open the top drawer. Her jewelry box lay inside, undisturbed. He opened it. Her favorite necklace, her earrings, her grandmother's locket, all there. He closed it, moving to the next drawer. Scarves, handkerchiefs, gloves. Nothing seemed out of place. He went through each drawer, his movements becoming more frantic. What was he looking for? He wasn't sure. Something personal, something connected to her, something the entity might want, or something she might have hidden. He moved to her nightstand. The drawer held paperback novels, reading glasses, hand lotion. Nothing unusual. He riffled through the books stacked on top. Mysteries, thrillers. Sarah had loved them. He picked one up, a dog-eared copy of a P.D. James novel. As he held it, a small, folded piece of paper slipped out from between the pages and fluttered to the floor. Mark frowned, bending to pick it up. It wasn't a bookmark. It was a piece of plain white paper, folded twice. His heart hammered against his ribs as he unfolded it. Inside, written in Sarah's familiar, slightly slanted handwriting, were just two things. A name, Elias Thorne, and an address, Black Willow Road, number 17. Mark stared at the paper, his mind racing. Elias Thorne. He'd never heard the name before. And Black Willow Road. He vaguely recognized it as being out in the wooded, more isolated outskirts of town, near where the accident had happened. Why would Sarah have this name and address hidden in a book? Who was Elias Thorne? And what connection, if any, did he have to Sarah, to her death, to the horrors now unfolding? Suddenly, the heat from the phone call took on a chilling new possibility. He won't let me rest. Was he this Elias Thorne? He heard David calling his name from the bottom of the stairs. Mark? What are you doing up there? Mark quickly refolded the paper, tucking it protectively into his pocket. He wasn't sure why, but instinct told him to keep this discovery to himself, at least for now. He needed to think. He needed to investigate. This was the first tangible clue he'd found, the first thread that led somewhere other than supernatural terror. It led to a person, a place. He walked out of the bedroom, pulling the door shut firmly behind him. He descended the stairs, trying to compose his features, trying to hide the sudden, fierce surge of purpose and dread that the small piece of paper had ignited within him. Find anything? David asked, looking up hopefully. No, Mark lied, shaking his head. Nothing. Just more questions. He walked towards the window, peering out into the rainy darkness. Elias Thorne. Black Willow Road. Whatever secrets Sarah had kept, whatever darkness she might have touched before her death, he was going to uncover them. Because maybe, just maybe, the answer to stopping the calls from below didn't lie in confronting a phantom, but in finding a man named Thorne. Chapter 5. Disconnected. The name and address burned like a physical weight in Mark's pocket. Elias Thorne. Black Willow Road, number 17. It was a lead, a tangible thread in a tapestry woven from static, whispers, and impossible horrors. While David slumped on the sofa, pale and exhausted, Mark felt a renewed, albeit terrified, sense of purpose. He couldn't fight shadows and disembodied chuckles, but he could investigate a name, an address. He could seek human answers, even if they led to inhuman truths. "Look," Mark said, turning from the window, trying to keep his voice steady. "We're exhausted. We're freaked out. Sitting here waiting isn't helping. Maybe we should try to get some sleep." It was a lie. He had no intention of sleeping, but he needed David out of the way, needed time to process this new information, to form a plan. David looked up, surprised. "Sleep? Here? Are you serious? Where else are we going to go?" Mark countered reasonably. "We can't stay awake indefinitely. Maybe things will seem clearer in the morning." He hoped he sounded convincing. "You take the guest room. I'll crash down here on the couch." He didn't want David upstairs, closer to the epicenter of the chill, closer to the bedroom where the entity had made its presence known. David hesitated, clearly reluctant, but the sheer exhaustion etched on his face was undeniable. He looked toward the stairs, then back at Mark. "You sure you'll be okay down here?" "I'll be fine." Mark lied again, forcing a reassuring smile. "Got the mag light. Keep your phone on." David nodded slowly. "All right, but yell if, anything happens." He pushed himself wearily off the sofa and trudged towards the stairs, pausing at the bottom. "Mark, be careful. You too, Dave." Mark listened until David's footsteps faded on the upper floor and the guest room door clicked shut. Then, silence descended once more, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain against the windows. He waited a few more minutes, straining his ears, ensuring David wasn't coming back down. Finally, convinced he was alone, he pulled the folded piece of paper from his pocket. Elias Thorne, Black Willow Road, number 17. He went into the kitchen, avoiding the living room where the landline sat like a silent predator. He spread the paper out on the kitchen table under the harsh glare of the under-cabinet light. Sarah's handwriting, clear, deliberate, not a hasty scribble. She had written this down for a reason. When? Before the accident? Why hide it in a book? He pulled out his laptop, booting it up, the sudden whir of the fan loud in the stillness. He connected to the sluggish Wi-Fi, his fingers flying across the keyboard. First, a search for Elias Thorne combined with their town name, Oakhaven. Several results popped up, mostly old census records, property deeds, mentions in historical society archives. Thorne seemed to be an old Oakhaven family name, dating back generations. But finding a current Elias Thorne proved difficult. No social media profiles, no recent news articles, no business listings. The man seemed to keep a deliberately low profile. Or perhaps he was elderly, reclusive? Then he searched for the address, 17 Black Willow Road. His browser loaded a map. Black Willow Road was exactly where he remembered, a winding, sparsely populated road cutting through the dense woods on the western edge of town, not far from the stretch where Sarah had crashed. Number 17 was situated deep down the road, set back from the pavement, surrounded by acres of forest according to the satellite view. An isolated property. Very isolated. Why would Sarah be interested in this man, this place? Had she met him? Was he connected to the accident? The he she mentioned, was it Thorne? Perhaps Thorne lived near the crash site, had seen something, or worse, had been involved. The timing felt too coincidental. A hidden note with a name and address near the location of her fatal accident. He leaned back, rubbing his tired eyes. This raised more questions than it answered. If Thorne was involved, why hadn't he come forward? If Sarah knew something about him, why hide the note instead of telling Mark? Had she been afraid? Afraid of Thorne? The house creaked around him. Mark jumped, his head snapping up, heart pounding. Just the house settling. Or was it the feeling of being watched hadn't dissipated? If anything, knowing about Thorne, about the address, made it feel more acute, as if his discovery had somehow alerted the presence in the house. He glanced nervously towards the darkened living room doorway. He needed to go there, to Black Willow Road. He needed to see the house, maybe even talk to Thorne, if he could. But going alone felt reckless, suicidal even, given the events of the past 24 hours. He needed backup. David? No. David was already traumatized, convinced they were dealing with supernatural forces. Bringing him into a potential confrontation with a potentially dangerous recluse seemed unfair, possibly counterproductive. Who else? Jessica? Sarah's sister was still fragile, consumed by her own grief. Burdening her with this, especially if it involved some dark secret of Sarah's, felt wrong. The police? He circled back to the same dead end. He had no proof, only disjointed fragments of terror and a name scrawled on a piece of paper. They wouldn't take him seriously. He was on his own. He looked at the clock. Nearly midnight. Going now, in the dead of night, in the pouring rain, seemed like something out of one of the horror movies he usually avoided. But waiting until morning felt unbearable. Whatever was happening felt like it was escalating, the entity growing bolder. The empty grave, the vanishing music box, time felt crucial. And the darkness, maybe the darkness offered a certain cover. He could scout the place out unseen. Decision made, Mark closed the laptop. He scribbled the name and address onto a fresh piece of paper, tucking the original safely back into his wallet. He needed supplies. He grabbed the mag light, checked its batteries. He found a spare in the utility drawer. He pulled on his still damp jacket, found a pair of old work gloves. Should he take something for protection? He looked wildly around the kitchen. A knife block sat on the counter. He hesitated, then pulled out the largest chef's knife. Its weight felt alien, dangerous in his hand. He wasn't a violent man, but he wasn't dealing with rational circumstances anymore. He slid the knife carefully inside his jacket pocket, the cold steel pressing against his ribs. He crept toward the front door, pausing to listen for any sound from upstairs. Silence. Good. He didn't want David waking up, trying to stop him. He quietly unlocked the deadbolt and slipped outside, pulling the door gently shut behind him. The rain had eased slightly, but the wind was still strong, whipping cold droplets against his face. He hurried to his own car, parked behind David's sedan, the engine starting reliably. He backed out of the driveway, casting one last glance at the house, dark, silent, holding his sleeping friend and unspeakable secrets, before turning towards the main road, towards the woods, towards Black Willow Road and the enigmatic Elias Thorne. The drive took him through the sleeping town, streetlights casting long, distorted shadows on the wet pavement. Oakhaven seemed unnervingly normal, peaceful, oblivious to the terrors Mark was experiencing. As he left the town limits, the streetlights disappeared, replaced by dense, dark woods crowding the edges of the road. He turned onto the county highway that led west, the same road Sarah had been driving on that fateful night. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles white. Was this where it began? Had she been heading towards Thorne's house? Or away from it? He slowed as he approached the area where the accident had occurred. There was no marker, no indication of the tragedy. Just a sharp curve, a stand of thick pine trees close to the shoulder, their bark scar where her car must have hit. He felt a wave of nausea, a fresh surge of grief. He pressed down on the accelerator, eager to get past the spot. A few miles further on, a small, weathered wooden sign announced Black Willow Road. It branched off the main highway, a narrow, paved track disappearing immediately into the dense, black woods. No other houses were visible. Mark hesitated for only a moment, then turned onto the road, his headlights cutting a weak tunnel through the darkness and the dripping trees. The pavement was cracked and uneven, forcing him to slow down. Overhanging branches scraped against the car roof. Startlingly loud. This felt like driving into another world, ancient and forgotten. He drove for what felt like a long time, maybe 2 miles deeper and deeper into the woods. The rain had stopped completely now, but a thick mist was rising from the damp ground, swirling ethereally in his headlights, reducing visibility even further. Finally, he saw it, a rusted, wrought iron mailbox nearly hidden in the overgrown weeds beside the road, the number 17 barely visible beneath the grime. A narrow dirt track, little more than 2 muddy ruts, led off into the trees. This was it. Mark pulled his car onto the soggy shoulder of Black Willow Road, parking well before the entrance to the dirt track, ensuring his car wouldn't be easily seen. He cut the engine and the headlights, plunging himself into near-total darkness, broken only by the faint moonlight filtering through the mist and the canopy above. The silence here was different from the silence in the house. It was the deep, watchful silence of the woods, filled with the faint rustle of unseen creatures, the drip of water from leaves, the sigh of the wind high in the pines. He took the mag light, checked the knife in his pocket, took a deep breath, and got out of the car. The air was cold, damp, smelling of wet earth and decaying leaves. He closed the car door as quietly as possible and started walking towards the dirt track, his feet sinking slightly into the muddy ground. He kept the flashlight off, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom, relying on the faint moonlight. The track wound through the trees, twisting and turning. The mist clung to the ground, swirling around his ankles like phantom tendrils. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every rustle in the undergrowth made him jump. He felt exposed, vulnerable, trespassing on territory that felt deeply unwelcoming. After walking for perhaps 5 minutes, the trees began to thin slightly ahead, revealing a clearing shrouded in mist. And in the center of the clearing stood a house. It was older than he'd expected, a 2-story structure built of dark, weathered wood, with a steeply pitched roof and narrow, dark windows that looked like vacant eyes staring out into the mist. A single, weak yellow light glowed dimly from one downstairs window, suggesting someone was home. The house seemed to sag slightly, leaning into the woods, as if slowly being reclaimed by nature. Overgrown bushes pressed against the walls, and vines snaked up the porch columns. It looked less like a home and more like something conjured from a nightmare. Mark crouched behind a large, moss-covered tree at the edge of the clearing, observing the house. No car was visible, but the track led around towards the back, presumably to a garage or shed. There were no sounds coming from the house, save for the faint hum of what might be a generator. Who was Elias Thorne? What secrets did this decaying house hold? He needed to get closer, maybe look in a window. He scanned the perimeter. The porch wrapped around the front, deeply shadowed. Getting onto it without making noise seemed risky. He decided to circle around the back, keeping to the tree line, hoping for a better vantage point. He moved slowly, cautiously, placing each foot carefully on the damp earth. As he rounded the side of the house, the mist swirled, momentarily revealing a small, dilapidated shed set back near the woods, its door hanging open at an angle. But his attention was caught by something else. Near the back corner of the house, close to the foundation, the ground looked disturbed. Darker patches of earth, clumps of uprooted weeds, similar to the horrifying sight at Sarah's grave. His heart pounded. He crept closer, using the overgrown bushes for cover. Yes, the ground had definitely been dug up here recently, and lying discarded near the edge of the disturbed patch, half hidden under a rhododendron bush, was a long-handled spade, its blade caked with fresh, dark mud. What had Thorne been burying? Or digging up? Mark risked shining the mag light beam, shielded by his hand, onto the disturbed earth. He saw something glinting in the mud. He reached down cautiously, his gloved fingers closing around a small, metallic object. He pulled it free, wiping away the clinging dirt. It was a locket, silver, heart-shaped, tarnished with age and damp earth. He pressed the small catch. It sprang open. Inside were 2 tiny, faded photographs. One was of a stern-looking woman he didn't recognize. The other was Sarah. Younger, smiling, carefree. Sarah's grandmother's locket. The one he'd seen in her jewelry box just hours ago. How had it gotten here? Buried in Elias Thorne's backyard? Before he could process the horrifying implications, a floorboard creaked loudly on the back porch, just above him. Mark froze, snapping off the flashlight, dropping instantly into a low crouch behind the rhododendron. He held his breath, listening. Footsteps shuffled across the wooden porch floorboards. A shadow fell across the patch of disturbed earth near him. A figure stood on the edge of the porch, silhouetted against the faint light spill from a back window. Tall, gaunt, dressed in dark, shapeless clothing. The figure leaned on a cane, peering out into the misty darkness, seeming to look directly towards Mark's hiding place. Mark pressed himself flatter against the damp ground, praying the thick bush concealed him. The figure remained motionless for a long moment, head cocked slightly, as if listening intently. Then a low voice drifted through the misty air, raspy and dry, like autumn leaves skittering across pavement. "I know you're out there." The voice rasped. "I can smell the fear on you. You shouldn't have come here. You shouldn't have dug where you don't belong." Mark's blood turned to ice. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. He was being watched. Thorn knew he was there. The figure chuckled, a dry, rattling sound utterly devoid of humor. "She warned you, didn't she? Told you the ground was watching." He paused, letting the words hang in the cold air. "She shouldn't have taken my secrets. Now she pays the price. And soon, so will you." The figure turned slowly and shuffled back toward the door, disappearing into the house. The back door clicked shut, leaving Mark alone in the oppressive silence of the woods, clutching Sarah's locket, the horrifying truth beginning to dawn. Thorn wasn't just connected. He was the he. He knew about the grave. He knew about the calls. And Sarah hadn't just stumbled upon his secrets. She had taken them. What secrets? And what price was she paying? Mark knew he had to get out of there, get back to the car, back to David. But as he cautiously started to rise, a sound reached him from inside the house. Faint, muffled, almost lost beneath the sighing wind. It was the sound of a woman sobbing. A desperate, heartbroken sound that sounded terrifyingly like Sarah, followed immediately by the slow, grinding, discordant notes of a familiar, tinkling melody. The music box. It hadn't vanished. Thorn had it. And maybe he had Sarah too. Not her body from the grave, perhaps, but something else. Her voice, her spirit, trapped in this decaying house, tormented by the man whose secrets she stole. The sound of Sarah's muffled sobbing, intertwined with the distorted, dying notes of the music box, sliced through Mark's fear, igniting a raw, protective instinct. Sarah, trapped in there with that man. Thorn, the gaunt figure leaning on a cane, smelling fear, talking about stolen secrets and prices paid. Whatever Sarah had taken, whatever Thorn was doing, it was monstrous. The phone calls weren't just echoes. They were cries for help from a tormented spirit held captive. He had to get her out. The thought was insane. How do you rescue a ghost? But the sound of her weeping, so real, so anguished, overrode all logic. He clutched the locket tightly in his glove, the chef's knife pressing uncomfortably against his ribs. He couldn't leave her here. He rose slowly from behind the rhododendron, his eyes fixed on the dark back door Thorn had disappeared through. He scanned the back of the house. The window beside the door was dark, but the one further down, where the faint light emanated, offered a potential glimpse inside. Keeping low, using the overgrown shrubs as cover, he crept towards it. The mist swirled around him, both concealing him and making him feel blind. He reached the window, cautiously raising his head just enough to peer over the sill. The glass was grimy, distorting the view within. It looked like a cluttered study or parlor. Bookshelves overflowed onto the floor. Stacks of papers covered every surface, strange artifacts, dried herbs hanging from beams, odd symbols painted on scraps of wood. Jars filled with murky liquids cluttered the room. In the center, under the weak glow of a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, sat a heavy wooden table. On the table lay the small wooden music box, now silent, and beside it, something else. A tarnished silver hand mirror, propped up against a stack of books. There was no sign of Thorn or Sarah. The sobbing had stopped. Mark frowned, scanning the dimly lit room again. Where had the sounds come from? Was Thorn hiding, waiting for him? Was it all a trick? He leaned closer to the window, trying to see into the shadowed corners of the room. As he did, his breath fogged a small patch on the filthy glass. He instinctively reached up to wipe it clear with his gloved hand. The slight movement, the faint scrape of fabric on glass, was enough. From the deepest shadow in the far corner of the room, something moved. Not Thorn. Something else. A flicker of movement. A deeper patch of darkness detaching itself from the surrounding gloom. Mark recoiled instinctively, stumbling back from the window, heart hammering against his ribs. Had Thorn left some kind of guard? Before he could react further, the back door of the house creaked open again. Not Thorn this time, but something else. Mark scrambled back towards the deeper shadows of the tree line, fumbling for the maglite, clicking it on, the beam shaking violently. Standing in the doorway, bathed in the weak yellow light from inside, wasn't the gaunt figure of Elias Thorn. It was a woman, pale, spectral, her form indistinct, shimmering slightly at the edges like heat haze. Her features were blurred, indistinct, but the simple cotton dress she wore, the way her long dark hair fell around her shoulders, it was Sarah, or a horrifyingly convincing imitation. She stood motionless, her head bowed slightly, her hands clasped before her. "Sarah," Mark breathed, taking an involuntary step forward. Hope surged, wild and irrational, warring with the terror that screamed this was wrong, a trap. The figure slowly raised its head. The face was clearer now, but horribly wrong. The skin was translucent, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones. The eyes were hollow sockets, empty pits of darkness that seemed to drink the light from Mark's flashlight. And the mouth, it stretched into a ghastly, impossibly wide smile, filled with too many teeth, sharp and predatory. It wasn't Sarah. It was a monstrous mockery wearing her shape. Sound of low, guttural chuckling, similar to the phone call, but seeming to come from the figure. The chuckle vibrated in the air, the same sound that had echoed from the empty grave. This was the entity, that he wasn't just Thorn. It was this thing, this parasite wearing Sarah's stolen image. Thorn was its servant, its keeper. The figure took a step out onto the porch, its movements jerky, unnatural. It raised a hand, beckoning Mark closer with long, pale fingers. The wide, predatory smile remained fixed. Mark recoiled, pure instinct taking over. He turned and ran, crashing blindly through the undergrowth back towards the dirt track, away from the horrifying apparition, away from the house of horrors. Branches whipped at his face. Roots threatened to trip him in the darkness. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel the entity's cold presence behind him, hear the dry rustle of its passage through the woods, keeping pace with him effortlessly. He burst out onto the dirt track, slipping in the mud, scrambling to his feet, and sprinted towards where he'd left the car. The track seemed longer now, the mist thicker, deliberately obscuring his path. He risked a glance over his shoulder. The spectral figure wasn't visible, but he could feel it, sense its cold focus on him. It wasn't chasing him to catch him, not yet. It was hurting him, toying with him. He finally saw the faint outline of his car, through the mist, parked on the shoulder of Black Willow Road. Relief surged, giving him a final burst of speed. He fumbled frantically with his keys, his fingers numb with cold and fear, finally managing to unlock the door. He threw himself inside, slamming and locking the door, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, coughed, sputtered, and died. Panic seized him. No, no, no. He twisted the key again, grinding sounds, but the engine wouldn't catch. He tried again, pumping the accelerator uselessly. Dead. Completely dead. Had Thorn done something? Or was it the entity's influence, stranding him here? He looked wildly out the windshield. The mist swirled thickly, pressing against the glass. And through the mist, approaching slowly, relentlessly, down the center of Black Willow Road, came the figure. The spectral mockery of Sarah, its dark eyes fixed on him, its horrifying smile seeming to widen. Mark scrabbled for the knife in his pocket, his hand closing around the handle. Useless. What good was a knife against that? He looked at the passenger seat, then back towards the house hidden in the woods. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't let it reach him. He threw the car door open and bolted, abandoning the useless vehicle, running blindly down the center of Black Willow Road, away from the approaching horror, back towards the main highway, towards the distant, illusory safety of Oak Haven. He ran harder than he'd ever run before, fueled by pure terror, the sound of his own ragged breathing loud in his ears, punctuated by the relentless, soft rustling somewhere behind him, always keeping pace. He didn't know if he could outrun it. He didn't know if escape was even possible, but he had to try. He had Sarah's locket clutched in one hand. The name Elias Thorne burned into his mind, and the chilling knowledge that the calls from below were only the beginning of a nightmare orchestrated by something ancient, malevolent, and wearing the face of the woman he loved. He finally burst onto the county highway, collapsing onto the wet asphalt, gasping for breath, looking back down the oppressive darkness of Black Willow Road. The mist swirled at the entrance, but the figure wasn't visible. Had it stopped at the edge of its domain? Or was it simply waiting? He scrambled to his feet, his legs shaking, and started stumbling down the highway. Back towards town, back towards his house, back towards David. He knew now this wasn't just about finding Sarah or stopping the calls. It was about survival. And it was about uncovering the secrets Sarah had died trying to expose. The secrets of Elias Thorne and the monstrous entity he served. The fight wasn't over. It had just begun. He had to get back. He had to warn David. He had to prepare. Because whatever resided on Black Willow Road wasn't content to stay there. It had reached out through the phone lines, desecrated a grave, and invaded his home. And it wouldn't stop until it had what it wanted. Or until Mark stopped it. He finally reached the outskirts of Oak Haven. The first streetlights appearing like beacons in the oppressive darkness. Exhausted, muddy, terrified but alive. He looked back one last time towards the dark woods, the locket feeling heavy in his hand. The ground was watching, and now he knew what watched from below. He had to face it, for Sarah, for himself. The final connection needed to be made or severed, permanently. What secrets did Sarah steal from Elias Thorne? Can Mark uncover the truth and confront the entity before it consumes him completely? The final pieces are falling into place. Make sure you're subscribed to Eli Nightfall. Ring that notification bell and leave a comment below. Tell me what you think Mark should do next. Your support fuels these descents into darkness. Until next time, try not to answer any unknown numbers.